Welcome back, folks. It's just about 18 minutes past the hour of 6 o'clock. It's a beautiful Thursday morning in downtown Port of Spain. We want to talk to the MSJ leader, but before we do that, we would like to find out more about the Prime Minister's trip to China. So here's Joel Brown with the latest.
An apology from the Prime Minister on Thursday for the lack of hotel bookings for Trinidad and Tobago journalists in Shanghai covering her visit to China. The Prime Minister, whose intervention in the pre-dawn hours of Thursday morning by designating members of her staff to address the problem led to an alternative accommodation being found for the media pool, offered an apology to the 12 journalists who were affected. The Prime Minister made the comment during a visit to a children's hospital in Shanghai. Earlier, she met briefly with the mayor of Shanghai and delivered the feature address at a business forum hosted by Invest TT. Reporting from Shanghai, Joel Brown, TV6 News.
All right, so that was Joel's update on the Prime Minister's visit to China. Apparently they had some accommodation problems for the journalists, but I suppose they would have sorted that out eventually. Well, Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro has said the number of deaths which can be connected to 2 weeks of anti-government protests has risen above 50. Official estimates put the number killed in clashes at 13. Mr. Maduro has blamed the violence on fascist groups. Local political party, the Movement for Social Justice, has publicly come out in support of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. And we have on the line leader of the MSJ, Mr. David Abdulah, and he will join us in a discussion on this and other matters. Good morning, Mr. Abdulah.
Morning, Hayden. Morning to your viewers and listeners.
How are you surviving the carnival season, sir?
Well, trying to survive. Went to a very good show last night, actually, Street Canal show. And, those artists continue to, try to raise consciousness through their music and so on, and what they commend them, and all the others who are contributing to the development of our carnival in positive ways.
Yes, most certainly, sir. Mr. Abdulah, there is some unrest taking place in Venezuela, and I'm sure that you've been keeping abreast of all of these events. I wonder if you could help us understand what is the source, what is the cause of the opposition's protests in Venezuela at this time?
Well, quite clearly, from the time that Hugo Chavez came into the presidency by democratic elections in Venezuela, the opposition forces, which really represent politically the traditional elite in Venezuela, the oligarchy, have never accepted the changes that have been initiated first by former President Chavez and continued by President Maduro. And you recall, for example, that in 2002, there was a coup against President Chavez, and he was able to return to office by way of popular intervention by, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan citizens who came out on the streets to oppose the coup makers. And in that few-day period of the coup, there was a statement by the U.S. government, recognizing the so-called new government and so on. So the U.S. quite clearly was very active in that whole process. So there's been a constant tension between, I would say, like 60-65% of the Venezuelan population who have supported over the years, by way of popular elections, the process of what has been called the Bolivarian Revolution. And, 30-35% of the population who have been opposed to that process of change. And what we're seeing in Venezuela is a continuation of that ongoing tension and struggle between opposing interest groups. Now, following President Chavez's re-election in late 2012, and remember he won a very significant electoral victory, even though he had been ill. He had recovered, and then he contested the election as president, won, and right after that he fell ill again and then passed away in March of 2013. President Maduro, according to the Constitution, then went up for the presidency and won a razor-slim victory, very, very close. And that buoyed the opposition forces, suggesting that, therefore, he didn't have a lot of legitimacy. However, in late last year, November last year, there were elections for local government positions, and the PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, and its allies, led by President Maduro, won again a very significant electoral victory, where they got, I think, over 60% of the popular vote. And since that time, you've seen the sections of the opposition forces beginning to organize in a way that, because they can't win an election, they now have to try to remove the government by other means. And they have used some very real issues, particularly shortages of food and other goods, and the crime situation, and those are very real issues, to mobilize support against the government. Now, part of the problem, particularly with food shortages and shortages of other items, part of the problem there is, in fact, the business sector, traditional importers, merchants, and so on, who have used their economic positions to create shortages. Part of the problem would, I'm sure, be due to economic policies by the government, which in terms of exchange controls and so on, which make trade more bureaucratic and more difficult. But those exchange controls themselves were precipitated by significant capital flight over a long period, where sections of the Venezuelan elite have been moving money out of Venezuela, causing significant pressure on the exchange rate and a black market, a thriving black market in foreign currency and so on. So there have been these different factors contributing to the food shortages and other shortages, and it is around that the opposition has been mobilizing people in mass demonstrations, and incidents of violence have resulted.
But Mr. Abdulah, are you suggesting that the opposition forces in Venezuela have a legitimate cause in mobilizing support to really put pressure on President Maduro to adjust his policies? Do you think that they have a just cause in all of this?
Well, what I'm saying is that there are real issues. There are shortages, yes. But what I'm saying is that those shortages themselves have been, over a period of time, created by not so much the policies of the government to start off with, but by actions of the oligarchy, of the business, sections of the business class, by way of capital flight initially, and also by way of artificial shortages, hoarding, and other actions that would have led to those shortages. So, if you provoke an issue, if you create an issue, you then mobilize around it. And so I'm saying that primarily the business class and sections of the oligarchy are the ones who have created the crisis and then are mobilizing around the crisis which they have created. And I think that you have to understand it in that context. As a process or strategies by the opposition to create the conditions that they can then try to mobilize support to bring people out on the streets against the government.
But, Mr. Abdulah, why then? I mean, Venezuela is a very rich country, given its natural resource base. Why hasn't President Maduro and former President Chavez, why have they not been able to counteract these strategies being utilized by the private sector, as you say, to undermine the legitimacy of their government?
Well, I mean, you recognize that they have attempted, various economic policies and so on. You recall that, and other kinds of policies. You recall that some time ago, President Maduro took control of the government, rather, took control of some import and distributive businesses and made available various items at reduced prices, and that was shortly before Christmas, if I'm not mistaken. So they have done various things. I said you have exchange controls in place, the import regulations and so on. They've attempted to directly be involved in the distributive trades by way of food and so on. But of course, one could debate and so on from here whether those policies and strategies are the correct ones or have been successful. So I think they have been making attempts. Whether they have found the right ways, another question. But I also do think that the majority of Venezuelans continue to support the government because the government has had mass demonstrations in support of it. But the media reports have been highlighting, of course, the opposition demonstrations. And quite clearly, I think that we have to look, and the U.S., of course, has denied any involvement, but we all understand geopolitics. And I'm very sure that the United States and interests like that are very active in Venezuela as well.
But all in all, Mr. Abdulah, if you were to look back at the regime of President Chavez, which has evolved into the new regime of President Maduro, would you say that the quality of life has improved in Venezuela over the past 14 to 15 years?
For very large sections of the population, the answer is a definite yes. All of the data, Hayden, point to the reality that when President Chavez came into government in 2000 or thereabouts, there were some like 40-odd% of the Venezuelan population living below the poverty line, and perhaps as much as 20% in serious poverty. Those figures have been reduced humongously, so that I think the number of people in Venezuela living below the poverty line now is perhaps about 15 or 18%. So, to reduce the numbers of people living in poverty by more than half is a very significant contribution. There have been major social programs of access to health care, housing, improved housing and so on, literacy programs that have moved, millions of people into or out of a condition of illiteracy, and many other social programs that have improved the quality of life of millions of Venezuelans. Remember, you made the point correctly earlier, that Venezuela is a resource-rich country like Trinidad and Tobago, with oil, but the economic gap, or the income gap between the rich and the poor in Venezuela has always been, and prior to President Chavez, has always been one of the worst, certainly in Latin America and the Caribbean. So a very few people relatively have controlled historically the largest slice of the pie. And it is that inequality and so on which President Chavez sought to redress, and did significantly change that equation. He also introduced a new constitution, which was popularly debated and discussed by Venezuelan people and implemented by parliamentary approval, which constitution also was with the objective of shifting some of the relations of power between the traditional oligarchy and, on the one hand, and the masses of Venezuelan people on the other. And that also was a very positive development in terms of governance and so on. So in many respects, the quality of life in Venezuela for the majority of people has improved tremendously. But of course, at the expense, if you wish, of the control and power of the traditional oligarchy. And it is that we are seeing continuing to play out over time. There is an ongoing, and has from day one been an ongoing struggle between those opposing interests.
But Mr. Abdulah, let me ask you the final question I want to ask you on the Venezuelan issue before we touch on some other national issues. The question is simply this: can Venezuela effectively transform itself via state control and price controls, including exchange rate controls and so on? Can they do that process? Can they effect that process of transformation without the support of the private sector, and more importantly, without properly functioning domestic markets?
Critical question here. I don't know if I could answer that in one line. The answer to that essentially is it could only be done, let me put it in the positive rather than in the negative. It can really only be done with the support of key sections of the business community. There's no doubt about that. And, you know, it raises a question, because I know that, in a sense, many people in Trinidad and Tobago are going to ask, well, what about Trinidad and Tobago? How do you go about transforming the Trinidad and Tobago economy to create greater equality and to redress injustice, social injustice? How do you go about that process, you know, without creating the kind of tensions that you have in Venezuela? And that really is what we in the MSJ are focusing on and are going to, you know, point out how it could be done by way of some major policy documentation, which we're going to present at our party congress on the 23rd of next month of March. It is, I think, one of the most difficult and challenging issues. How does a culture escape from itself, as Lloyd Best would say? How do you transform the reality without those who enjoy privilege resisting to the point of frustrating that change? President Obama has faced it in the United States, and he hasn't tried to transform the American economy. He's tried to make some changes on the margins and has been opposed by the right-wing forces in the Republican Party, the Tea Party group, and those other elements, who don't want to have universal medical health care in the United States, who don't want to have the minimum wage increase. Those are not radical changes. Those are just basic things to move people out of poverty, who don't want to have significant government expenditure on, say, major infrastructure projects to create jobs and reduce unemployment, which remains high in the United States. So if President Obama faces those difficulties in the U.S. from an entrenched conservative element representing interest groups, the gun control lobby, for example, is another one in the U.S. President Chavez and President Maduro are facing those same challenges in Venezuela, and we're going to face those same challenges in Trinidad and Tobago if we want to see social justice and greater equality and fairness in our society take place. And you really have to appeal to people's good nature and their commitment to decency. And they are very decent business people here in Trinidad and Tobago, and have a coherence around a vision and program that would see all benefit rather than some being left at the margins of human existence.
And sir, as we talk about the comparative situation between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela, are you of the opinion that the people of Trinidad and Tobago are ready for that kind of economic and social transformation that the MSJ advocates to its membership?
I think so, yes, in the sense that many people in this country are unhappy about not only economic policies which result in marginalization. We have far too many of our citizens, what is it, 15-70% of the population living below the poverty line in this small country, 1.3 million people with, significant resources and so on. We see too many problems of basic things, water, transportation, healthcare, housing, which are requirements of any civilized society providing for all of its citizens. We see too many problems in those areas. So in terms of people having problems, yes, I think that the population wants to see change. But how we get that change, the population is not persuaded about how we get that change in terms of what are the measures, what are the policies that are necessary to bring about the change in a way that does not destroy, but rather builds. And I think that is the key. We have to bring about change in a way that builds and not destroys or mashes up the place.
Well, speaking of change, the Prime Minister on her visit to China indicated that she has negotiated with the Chinese government to provide Trinidad and Tobago with some long-range patrol vessels, admitting that we are in desperate need of these vessels to protect our relatively open borders. I know that the MSJ made a few comments on this particular issue. Could you just reiterate some of the concerns or some of the matters that you raised in relation to this revelation?
Well, actually, we haven't yet. So the statement with our first public one in on this issue, which just came out in the news yesterday, it's quite it's staggering. I'm trying to find the right word. Staggering that the Prime Minister could go to China without an agenda or apparently without any cabinet approval and on the spot make such a request in a way that appears to be inappropriate, because the release suggested that the Prime Minister almost was pleading with the Chinese Premier to allow Trinidad and Tobago to get access. We don't know if it is purchased, whether it is a contribution by the Chinese government to Trinidad and Tobago. We don't know the terms and so on of one of these vessels, and it points to, this whole issue points to the collapse of good governance in the country, because good governance is about procurement in a standard way. You don't see a vessel or hear the Chinese are building a vessel and procure it by way of the Prime Minister saying to the Premier, I want that. It's not going into a supermarket and buying a bag of okras. You're talking about the acquisition of a significant asset, a complicated piece of equipment, which is supposed to be procured by a process.
Yes.
And it goes back to what the MSJ said in 2012, why we left the government. We signaled in March that we were unhappy about the issue of procurement, that it had not been fundamentally addressed by the government in terms of legislation. And 2 years afterwards, we still have no public procurement legislation. So 4 years after we made a commitment as part of the partnership to bring about proper public procurement in the country, we still don't have it. and it's not that difficult a piece of legislation to bring into being.
Well, Mr. Abdulah, you know, we want to properly interrogate these issues and try to bring a greater level of clarity to what's happening with regard to all of these concerns. I wonder if we could invite you to come on the show next week after the carnival celebrations are well over, and so that we can get back to some sober discussions about what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago. Is that acceptable to you?
By all means, I would be very happy to do so. Hayden.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. David Abdulah. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us this morning. We have a packed program for you right here on Morning Edition. Remember, this is our carnival version of Morning Edition this week, and we're going to take a break and come right back to you, so stay with us.